Hello and welcome to the 215th episode of From Alpha to Mega. Today is Wednesday the 30th of April 2025 and I'm your host Tom O'Brien. This episode we welcome Roger Arevalo to the podcast to talk about the Vanguard Method, the brainchild of the British management consultant John Seddon. Roger is a socialist who has a vast wealth of knowledge of modern management and organisational theory. In particular, he's an admirer of the Vanguard Method and its applicability for a socialist economy. This is part one of a two-parter, second part of which will be released in the coming week. This episode I have the new patrons Madeline and Henrik Fenrick to thank. If you'd like to help support the show, please head on over to the Patreon and throw me a few commie dollar. And if you're listening on YouTube, please give the show a like and make a comment to juice that algorithm. And if you're a podcast listener, give it a review on your podcatcher of choice. Finally, if you'd like to support the book project Donal and myself are working on, head on over to the Classless Society in Motion.com. We literally couldn't do this project without all your help. Okay, to the discussion. Okay, today we've got Roger Arevalo here to talk to us about some books that he has recommended we should read on the Toyota production system as applied to services. So this is the work of the British management consultant called John Seddon. Now, there's a couple of books he has out here. I've read two or three of them that Roger recommended. There's Freedom from Command and Control. That's from 2005. Another one called Beyond Command and Control, which is from 2018 or 2019, I think. And another one here called Systems Thinking in the Public Sector from 2008. Okay, so he's quite an interesting character, this John Seddon. He set up a consultancy called, I think, Vanguard Consultancy. And he has basically applied the kind of principles behind the underlying the TPS to lean services. Roger, how did you come across this work?
Give you the context on this. I've been a revolutionary socialist since I was 14. When I was like late teens, early 20s, I was getting a very big sense of there was something missing in how we understood what had gone wrong in the Russian Revolution. The normal explanation for why it had gone to hell wasn't making sense. And I got the sense it was to do with organization. So I started reading a lot of stuff about organizational theory, project management and stuff like that. And also things like industrial relations theory. And just by chance, a friend of mine was working at, I guess at this time, it was like a paper mill or a chemical plant. And he was talking about the environmental standard, ISO 14000, and said it was a really good system. But then said that, if I remember this right, the ISO 9000 was really a pain and it caused a lot of problems. So just at the end of the day, I was just curious about it, and I looked up ISO 9000 on Wikipedia. And in the references at the bottom was an article by John Seddon, which is also a book, which I've never actually read, called The Case Against ISO 9000. And I just started looking on his website, which was very different back then to what it was now. It was a lot easier back then to get a lot of like articles and other information. And I just found myself reading this and over just like a day or two thinking, this is it. This answers all the questions I had and what the problems I was seeing in the Russian Revolution. This is the explanation about how it could have been organized to make it work. As far as I know, John Seddon is not a revolutionary or a socialist. And although you could be forgiven for thinking otherwise when you consider his company is called Vanguard. And if you look at the company symbol, it looks like a Bolshevik propaganda poster, sort of constructivist art. But also this, so by accident covered what the Bolsheviks had done wrong. And when Seddon goes over the older management styles and in the sort of era of Fordism and Taylorism, the origins of what he calls the management factory, which was the management techniques that were developed by McKinsey and General Motors when they were just trying to get control over these massive, sprawling industrial organizations that were kind of on a scale that nobody had ever run before. they had to come up with these new organizational methods, which sort of worked. They let them get some degree of control over what was going on in these organizations, but they also caused a lot of massive problems to do with separating sort of management and planning away from where the work was done, which is a infamous feature of like Ford and Taylor, but also in terms of management and accounting. The people making the decisions weren't on the ground where the work was being done. So they could just do management and accounting, look at a bunch of numbers and give local managers targets and try and tell them what to do with basically no sense of what local conditions actually were.
So this kind of numbers, this control of production by the kind of management of financial quantities, we see as a massive, in cybernetic terms, it's a massive like compression in the variety of the system down to these like monetary numbers that miss a whole, try to govern the system through like these single kind of estimators as opposed to the multidimensional nature of work has had like huge deleterious effects.
Yeah, and where this becomes a problem for more than just capitalism is the Bolsheviks took this on completely. And in some ways, it's kind of reasonable. It was state of the art at the time. Nothing better had really been invented that they could have latched onto. But it created a lot of problems. Partly of this massive enthusiasm for it in Russia was because of Russia's economic backwardness. They just looked at what was going on in Russia, and not just the Bolsheviks, like the whole Russian population. Like Russian peasants would get hold of an American magazine from somewhere and see like these pictures of like these incredibly sophisticated like farms with tractors and stuff and just think whatever they did to get this, we want it. But the massive problem with that is because the whole management factory had been built so much on disempowering the workers, both for these sort of practical breaking the power of the working class kind of thing and prejudice against workers, but also this was just all that had been thought up as a possible solution at the time. The Bolsheviks took it on, and that whole attitude to the working class kind of fused with a pre-existing bit of Marxist theory about how factory labor would discipline the workers. And it creates this cascade of a massively anti-democratic non-trust of the workers that if you just follow that step by step down, basically that leads to Stalin. And you can see it all the way back in, you could actually say that sort of Soviet democracy died in 1903 at the conference where the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks split. Not saying that the Mensheviks were necessarily in the right, but when Lenin is a big part of Lenin's case was defending even like the sort of brutality and autocracy of the factories because it disciplined the workers. Another spin-off from that same time was a debate about the role of the intellectuals in the movement. This is kind of a tangent. And something Karl Kautsky said about how the intellectuals need to be subsumed into the working class movement and disciplined by it. And, to a certain extent, you do need a certain amount of order and discipline to make this kind of thing work. But they leaned into it so far. And like the anarchists were screaming at them, this is going to be a disaster. Do not do this. But the anarchists, as well as the kind of stereotype of anarchists being utterly chaotic and can't organize anything, there was no alternative for industrial organization and like a real method of workers' control at the time that they could offer as an alternative. So from very early on, this cascade starts of this fusion of capitalist method and a kind of odd and questionable part of Marxist theory gets going. And once it's going, there's almost no consideration of doing anything any other way. And that is my theory about what ultimately takes the Russian Revolution off a cliff.
Yeah, so we've had people, some people claim, the problems were, when Stalin came to power in 28. Some say it was, I don't know, the Brest-Litovsk Treaty of 1918 or whatever it was. Roger, you're going further back in time now to 1903. I'm very impressed.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's always a funny thing. You can always tell what sort of socialist somebody is by what year they disown the Russian Revolution. And it's an interesting thing. It doesn't all fall apart at once. There's like combined and uneven degeneration, and some of the bits of like the most intellectual kind of proto hippie artists commune kind of bits are still intact in some degree, like sort of 27, 28. But some other stuff is falling within days. And especially in like that first week of after the revolution, where the Bolsheviks seem to do insanely irrational things, like they turn on some of their closest socialist allies in the Soviet. They nearly get into a war with the rail union and all sorts of other weird stuff. But because also, as well as this end of management consulting, I've got a background in like human factors and crew resource management from like the airlines and other dangerous industries kind of stuff. I was actually looking at this and thinking, this doesn't sound like politics. This sounds like sleep deprivation. Because if you think how much sleep Lenin and Trotsky probably got in the week running up to the insurrection, knowing what they were about to attempt, how much sleep would you get? And then after they've pulled it off, they're still running on adrenaline, probably still can't sleep. And now they have to run this revolution at its most critical part. And no wonder stuff starts getting weird and going off the rails.
Yeah, I don't doubt it. So I suppose for people, we should probably bring it back maybe a little bit towards Seddon and his insights. It is interesting you mentioned it, like it's called the Vanguard Method. I think he comes out of like academia as a psychologist and working in Africa, I think, in charities. So, and he does a lot of work for the public sector. He seems kind of like some kind of establishment Keynesian of some type. That's maybe my instinct. I wouldn't be surprised if he's throwing in the Vanguard stuff as a kind of a grenade or something into the business sphere for some reason. I wouldn't be surprised. But let's talk about perhaps let's go towards what his deep insights are. Donald, did you want to like maybe ask a question here for Roger?
Yeah, I suppose just to frame the thing. So he obviously is someone who studied the Toyota production system very deeply. And how does he take inspiration from that, and how does he build on it?
Yeah, okay, so first thing to understand about how a lot of this is described is in a world where the management accounting and the management factory hadn't happened, this would probably be a lot quicker and easier to explain. But in the same way, socialists spend so much of their time criticizing capitalism because that has to be overcome first. In a lot of the ways he frames this is overcoming the kind of bureaucratic nightmare that's built up in both private sector and public sector service industries that have been built on the management factory. That's just something to keep in mind about how some of this stuff is couched and explained. But basically, how it started in Toyota is in contrast with Ford. Part of how this worked was because Ford was rich, they could afford to have just like a whole wall of the factory full of metal presses. Each one doing stamping body parts and other bits and pieces. And these metal presses, it took about 10 days to change a die, to change it from stamping one thing to another. And because Ford's big, they're rich, that doesn't really matter. Toyota, at the time they're getting going, they have one metal press, and like they're like really low tech. Like I think some of the early bonnets of some of their vehicles were made they had a tree trunk that was just the right shape and they just hammered it out over this tree trunk. But demand starts going up, I think, especially for their trucks that they were selling to the Americans for the Korean War. And this one metal press, you can't take 10 days to change over the die. It's not going to happen. So they really study it and figure out all these little tricks of how you can use it optimally, and including stuff like figuring out which bits of the thing you need to do to change the press, when it's running, you can just do when it's running, or when you have to wait until it stops to do. And they figure out all these bits and pieces, and they get the press time, the changeover down, then to like 3 days. They get it down to 3 days, then like 3 hours. It takes a while, but eventually they get it down to something insane like 55 seconds. And then they figure out, because they're doing this ability to fast change the dies, that you don't have to run a massive amount of same product out the door and then change the die and run another massive amount out. And it's better to put variety in the line and make just one of it, alternate like one of everything or just a few of everything and then change it over. And this has all sorts of quality and production flow improvements. And so what John Seddon does is take this whole thing, and the toy production is not just that, it's very complicated and there's a lot of technical bits to it, but takes this idea into the service industries, which have been massively gummed up by management trying to copy this sort of these sort of Kafkaesque nightmares of multi-generational bureaucracies. But it's like that. It is a nightmarish structure of trying to copy old style factory production into service industries. And the way it works in services, you get stuff like the front office, back office split. And this is like I'm saying, that a lot of the Vanguard Method stuff just sounds like what would make sense to run an organization that way. But because they've got the management factory in their brains, they have things like front office and back office to try and save money and get supposed economies of scale, which is a massive myth in all sorts of ways. But then you get like a demand coming into the front office, whatever it is, like housing benefits, say. And then they have to batch up all the demand into a big pile and then send it to the back office. And then the back office has to process all this, send it back to the front office, who will then deal with the customer or the citizen or whoever this person is. And just at every stage of the process, there's opportunities for inefficiencies to come in and waste, flaws. And this is a part of the Vanguard Method terminology, is the value work is the work we actually want to do. Like, I want to order this product, I have this problem, please solve it, and so on. It's just what the organization is there to do. And failure demand is everything that results as a failure to do something or do something right for that person. So failure demand is stuff like, I don't understand the form. I wanted a blue one, you sent me a green one. Or the front office having to call the person back and saying, you need to bring in a different kind of ID. We don't have enough of your documents and stuff like that. And I know being to do with Marxism, talking about value being a good thing is going to be kind of a brain screw for some people who are all about eliminating the value form, but we'll have to work with the terminology we have here. And going back to the management factory, what this does is, every time you do a handoff, you just introduce the opportunities for more failure demand, more waste. Like you'll lose stuff passing it back to the back office, or the people in the back office don't have the skill level or the knowledge of the person at the front end to solve the problem. Then it comes back again. And I'm saying front office, like some cases, this is where people actually walk into a physical office, but it can also be like a call center and calls getting passed around in this nightmarish labyrinth kind of thing. This is like what the management factory hath wrought. And the Vanguard Method is like the combined system of how to untangle this and fix it so that it just flows smooth and efficient. The customer gets what they need in as little time and with as little aggro as possible. That's part of it, is just the understanding the demand from what the customer needs and just solving that as simply as possible. And the other half of the Vanguard Method is like the intervention theory, how you actually go into a place to do this, how you talk to people, how you study the work with both managers and workers in a way so that they can understand what the management factories dug them into, and see the potential of doing it a different way without just triggering a massive defensive response and them not wanting to have anything to do with you.
Right. So he takes this idea of flow that is kind of built into, say, the TPS, this end-to-end time, production time. I think there was a quote, I think, in one of Seddon's books where they asked Taiichi Ono, the kind of inventor of the TPS, when he was like basically nearly dead or retiring, and they asked him, what is concerning you at the moment? What are your focus on? And Ono said, reducing the time it takes from when a customer order comes in for the car to be produced, right?
Well, no, yeah, he actually said reducing the time from when the customer order comes in to getting the money.
Right, yeah, you're right.
And you get the money once the car is delivered, so...
Right. And so it's like that kind of end-to-end flow, and Seddon was saying, can you imagine asking any CEO and like in some normal big corporation, they'd never give something that was so associated with the actual work. What Seddon is doing then is he's taken this concept of flow, this end-to-end time, and kind of figuring out what is the equivalent for, say, services. So in this instance, say the public housing benefit or benefit scheme, or, a call center is from the customer's point of view. Say, I want to figure out, can I get my unemployment check? Like I come to the store and then I get it the next day or whatever. Like, that's what I'm interested in, that the management of the whole system should come out of the flow and the work. This seems like, kind of, when you read it, it seems like such obvious stuff, but the structures of control, these top-down hierarchical, essentially money targets, which budgeting controls and managing of the activity as a worker in this instrumentalized way, doesn't have the requisite variety to deal with actually the demands coming in, and there's a complete just disaster in terms of the actual customer experience.
And not just with financial management, but any kind of control or target setting, from anything like you have to answer the phone within 2 rings, or you have to see so many patients a day, or you get the other thing that is possibly related to socialist planning. If you set a target for how much of something is to be produced, that's going to create the same kind of train wreck. This isn't like official any management theory. I think this is just my own thing that I came up with about the difference between an order and a target. A target just says make this many, but every order has a delivery address. It's not just something that's come out of the air. Each one is a demand to be satisfied. And it's not just somebody thinking we should make this many. There's an interesting thing to do with how people talk about planning in the Soviet Union. As far as I'm concerned, by that point, Russia was so far gone, we can't really learn anything from it about workers' management, workers' control of industry. It's just sort of interesting management stories that may carry the same potential for insights as from a capitalist country. And one of the things about that is, in the Soviet Union, how material hoarding was a thing. Factory managers would have their private stash. And like in Freedom from Command and Control, how it talks about, and maybe in some of the other books as well, talks about utilities maintenance of like electric cables under the road and stuff. It's not in any of the books, but I think it's in one of the videos where they're talking about it, about this management consultant going out with this crew who work on various utilities. And he says they'd just done another sort of management factory thing. Instead of having really local stockpiles of all the stuff the crew would need, they had them in like larger regional depots for supposed economies of scale. And this crew had this job that they just couldn't fix with what they had on hand. And there were problems with getting the key components from the depot. So they drove to this quiet place. I opened up a gate, And one of them says to the management consultant, don't tell anybody about this. And they push their way through the undergrowth and come to this old overgrown shed with a brand new padlock on it. And they open the padlock, open the doors, and there's just shelves of everything they need in there. So the moral of this story is, if people close to the work are having to maintain their own private stash and have their own storeroom off the books, that tells you there's something wrong with the system. It's like, although a lot of the Soviet planning stuff, I can't remember who said this. It might have been Auxiliary Statements or General Intellect Council. What are they called?
General Intellect Unit.
General Intellect Unit, that podcast, who described Soviet planning as a bunch of dead-eyed psychopaths roaring at each other. That was kind of, that was very definitely an element of it. But the fact that this happened in such different structures and organizations, I think is very good evidence that if people are hoarding stuff, that's a symptom of a flawed system, not of planning as a whole. And part of it is just like an accounting convention, where if having a bunch of stuff in inventory makes you look good to like either higher ups or the some sort of auditor or the shareholders or something, then you're just going to do it to look good, regardless if it's sort of turning your factory into a warehouse. And there's a great story about an American manufacturing plant. They had a car that they were going to give away as a prize for something like either a reward to their workers for like most improvement, or they were going to like raffle it off for charity or something. And a few days later, the car was missing and they reported it to the police. And like a week later, they found it. It hadn't gone anywhere. So much inventory had just been piled up in front of it. Nobody could see it anymore.
Yeah, I read that one. All right. Yeah, that was a good one. So one of the things that Seddon really focuses on is on this concept of the capability measure. Do you want to discuss a little bit about that and the thinking behind it?
This is something that comes from another management consultant who I don't think I've mentioned before, W. Edwards Deming, who wrote a book called Out of the Crisis, which is another sort of classic and also in this family tree of management consultants. And it came from a guy originally called Shewart. And it's called, the full name is a statistical process control chart. And what it is a chart that you mark on what is relevant to your organization. So, for example, a housing association might do a control chart or capability chart of how long it takes once one of their tenants moves out, how long it is before they can get the next tenant in. Because this will tell you a lot of stuff about how you do your repairs, how you advertise a vacancy, and how you do the whole qualifying a tenant, moving them in process. And so what you do is you got this chart and you mark off on it, like each time it happens, how long it takes you to move a new tenant in. And then you draw a line on it to give you a sense of how that is changing over time. And you do these statistical tricks to it that you get, like the upper control limit and the lower control limit. As long as stuff is between those two lines, you can say that's in control. That's like what the organization is predictably achieving. And you can go through it and like mark off specific exceptions. Like, we couldn't let this house in in a normal amount of time because it was like a crime scene and the police didn't give it back to us for ages or whatever. You can just notate it, just to make sure you can explain outliers. Or if something went really well and it was really quick, you can notate why that went so well. But what this also does is it gives you an average over time. And then when you figure out what your organization, you start digging into your organization and figuring out ways to improve. The statistical process chart will show you the results of your actions, whether it worked or not. And you can see some of the diagrams reproduced in the book. And it's just like absolute chaos. And you can just see like the hell of this. Like some people, it's taking like 192 days to get their like health or social work issue resolved. And you can just see how awful this would be. And then when they introduce some new measures and some new organizational structure, the chart from just being chaotic just drops down to be so much quicker, so much more steady, and so much more in control and predictable. And the upper and lower control lines drop with it to be much, much narrower.
Right, and so that these capability charts, they come out of the work. So instead of this kind of idea that he's constantly harping against, he's written whole books about it that we haven't read or discussed. Whitehall targets. So targets coming from, 10 Downing Street saying we want to have so many operations done, or some, it takes you so long to be seen by a GP. These targets themselves, they end up in these like game playing, we can pick up the phone and we can say that's a consultation and hang up on them, and we can say we've seen them. But actually, when you measure it from the viewpoint of the customer, right, say the person going into trying to get a GP appointment, that you get a true measure of that flow. And like that, by kind of examining the actuality of the work, right, can you actually manage to change the system, bring those bounds and down, and take out failure demand. The understanding has to come out of the work, and this is something that, like as you've been saying, is totally lost. And moreover, he says stuff like 95% of the variation in the system is not by like worker A is better than worker B, which is what most of the attention of management goes on to, giving individual targets and bonuses for doing the job quicker than usual, which might have nothing to do with your own individual ability. And that 95% of the variation is just a function of the system itself, and that it's the system that needs to be managed and not the individual.
Oh yeah, that is a great part of the book, and it's just like a couple of pages or 3 pages or so of, do you have a people problem? And it's just stage by stage, all the questions you can ask yourself. It just reveals piece by piece how this probably isn't a people problem. This is either like in the organizational structure, how the workflow is managed, and then it gets a bit more people, but saying like job aids or training, but it's still up to the system to fix that. And it just cuts it down further and further and further until you get to the end where, I forget which management theorist it was now, could have been Russ Lakoff, and it said that like 95% of it is the system, and only the last 5% may be down to individual differences in people.
Donald, do you have anything you want to ask or talk about in particular?
Well, I've been discussing this stuff with a friend of mine who is a management accountant for the last couple of weeks. And one of the big, not objections that you get, but one of the kind of things that it's very hard for people to get their head around, I think, is the question of why management wouldn't just be able to do this. Why does it have to be the case that only the people who are doing the work are in a position to improve the system by designing against demand, all the stuff you've talked about, end-to-end time and figuring out how to meet demand. So, yeah, the question I want to ask is, why couldn't you just do all this through what Seddon calls command and control methods, where management just figures out where all the waste is the waste hidden? I mean, what's the problem?
Well, this actually is an interesting part of the intervention theory, is that like the basic answer is that management can't do it from a distance because there is just too much going on. It's like there's no way to tell from like your corner office what is going on down wherever the work is actually being done. And so to illustrate, it's an interesting story from the book Black Hawk Down, where the American soldiers are in the middle of a massive firefight in Mogadishu. And one of the Black Hawks crashes into the city. And there's a group of American soldiers not that far away. And they say, there's 2 sensible ways you could handle this. One is the soldiers, they can see the smoke trail, they can just crash straight towards it, go to the helicopter, rescue the crew. The slightly more sophisticated way you can do it is the still intact helicopters flying overhead. They can get on the radio, talk with the ground troops and guide them in, and it'll be a more precision move, and they may not get stuck down a dead end or anything. But because the commander back at the airfield was one of these real command and control types, he insisted that the air crew radio to him where the ground troops should go, and then he would radio back to the ground troops. And this created such a lag. They were missing turns, they were getting lost, they overshot the crashed helicopter. And that just perfectly illustrates why the manager just can't see enough and can't see fast enough to make the decision that needs to be made. But also from the intervention theory point of view, also the manager doesn't just say to the worker, you're there, you know what's going on, you deal with it as you see fit. Although that would probably be a pretty decent solution. What the manager actually does is sit with the worker and watch what is coming on and keep an eye on it with all these, like the Vanguard Method standards, nature, like type and frequency of demand, what matters to the customer, and also keep in mind what stuff is going on in the system that they set up is stopping this customer getting what they need. This isn't something that you do just leave to the frontline workers. You put the managers down on the front line as well, because this is the only way they can learn and understand the true nature of what their organization does. And it's crucial both in the sense of management buy-in, because managers can completely sabotage this if they want to. If you want to get the managers to both believe in that there is a better way to do this and understand deeply in their bones what the better way is, they need to be at the front lines long enough to truly understand the nature of what is going on. And then what happens is they can then work with the workers to restructure the system to do what really needs to be done. And then they can trust the worker to handle their part of it. And then the manager can move back into the supporting role and like working on the system at a bigger level that the frontline worker either doesn't have the knowledge to work on, or if they're just too busy doing their own job to do that, the manager can do that around them and look after the bigger picture. And there's a funny thing from a TV news report from like about 1985, one of the first companies that did this, it was kind of a joke. It went through the process, but then after it had been done, it showed this sort of gag scene of there was now so little for the boss to do. He was just sat at his desk with his feet up, just like looking lost and not knowing what to do. And that is funny, and that it's just sort of just comedy in its own right. And it's also kind of appealing to socialists, rendering the boss redundant. But it's not exactly accurate, because there are still stuff that the workers can't do for themselves, either at least under conventional circumstances. If they were going to take on management role as well, they'd either have to work longer hours or spend less time doing the frontline job, so they'd have time to do the more system level stuff. So I know that is an option, but there is a true healthy role for management to be stepped back and to be in a supporting role and looking after the system to make sure the frontline workers can do their job properly.
I think it's a really interesting analogous situation that you mentioned about the Black Hawk Down stuff. Like, to me, it's a really quite profound point that he makes in terms of saying that there are details about the production process that are simply not known to, let's say, higher management or to the people who would normally be setting these budgets. And so when you have activity being controlled, budgets that are made in this command and control usual business framework, they actually bring forward the waste from one period to the next without understanding the distinction between waste and necessary work. And so it's sort of embedded into the system in a way that's really impossible to get around unless you have the actual reform of the production process being done at the level where the work is happening.
And that's also one of the really bad things about computerizing stuff. If you didn't go through the process to understand the work to begin with, you just fossilize the waste inside the computer.
Yeah, and it's something that it's very interesting from reading about the Toyota production system, is that, you know, how Ono would, the last resort would be to bring in computerization for a process. And often, like, you know, robotics and stuff, they would be late adopters for many of these techniques because they want to see how they actually work and study them before they introduce them.